Hello everyone. In today's story, please listen to how a family conflict changed the lives of everyone involved. Now, let's begin.
The frequency was listed as closed. That was the first fixed point. Not a rumor, not yet a legend. A line in the records connected the frequency to a former radio station in West Texas. The station had stopped operating. Its license had been closed. The visible facility would later disappear as well. The remaining documents do not provide a clear reason for the shutdown. That absence matters, but only in a limited way. An incomplete file is not proof of concealment. It may reflect ordinary administrative loss, a change in ownership, or paperwork that never preserved the full story. The record allows those explanations. It does not select one. What it does establish, according to the surviving account, is that the frequency had an identifiable history before listeners began reporting the signal. The station itself belonged to an older kind of radio landscape. West Texas offered distance, open ground, and long stretches with little electrical interference. A receiver could pull in a weak transmission from far away. Atmospheric conditions could alter its strength. Equipment could introduce drift, hiss, or brief changes in tone. Those limits made careful notes important. The amateur radio hobbyist who reportedly noticed the transmission did not begin with a theory about a hidden message. The first discovery was more ordinary. A tuning attempt brought up a signal where silence was expected. The listener checked the dial, listened again, and recorded what could be confirmed. The frequency matched the one associated with the closed station. That connection was later checked against license and regulatory references. The details are described through copies, recollections, and reported consultation of FCC material. The story does not provide a complete case file. It does not establish every step taken by an agency investigator. It does show the shape of the official trail as listeners understood it. The station had ended. The reason remained unclear. The reported response from the FCC was not a formal investigation that settled the matter. Accounts characterized the agency as declining or not pursuing one. That is a reported response, not an independently confirmed institutional finding. Still, it left the listeners with a narrow contradiction. The administrative record treated the frequency as finished. Private logs treated it as active. The transmission itself was described as short and stable. It did not resemble a normal broadcast with music, identification, or conversation. It appeared, according to the accounts, as a repeated announcement. The delivery was flat. The pauses were controlled. The sound seemed less like a live voice than a stored statement played through a transmitter. Its wording is reserved for the recordings and transcriptions examined later. For now, the important detail is the repetition. One reception could be blamed on confusion, a wrong dial setting, a neighboring signal, a memory altered by time. But the story circulated among more than one amateur listener. Some kept tuning notes. Others claimed to have recordings. Online communities later compared those accounts, looking for shared details and for signs that the reports had influenced one another. The station's closure became more than background. It became the point where the paper trail stopped answering questions. After that point, the frequency acquired a second identity. It was still an entry connected to a former broadcaster. It was also the place where listeners said the announcement returned. No surviving record clearly explains how those two facts could coexist. Was the unclear closure merely incomplete paperwork, or did someone have a reason to keep the station's final chapter indistinct? The regulatory file ended where the private record began. Listeners did not describe a station returning to normal operation. They described a brief event on a frequency they believed should have been quiet. The accounts came from different people, using different receivers, in different parts of the West Texas corridor. Their notes were not uniform. That is important. One amateur radio hobbyist reportedly noticed the signal while tuning across the band. The first entry was not written as a story. It was written as a check. Frequency, approximate time, signal strength. A short description of what was heard. The entry also recorded an attempt to return to the frequency later. That second attempt is where the account became difficult to dismiss as a momentary mistake. The sound had returned. Other listeners later claimed they had heard it as well. Some kept tuning logs. Some preserved only a transcription. At least one account referred to a recording made from a receiver speaker. The source material does not establish a complete chain of custody for that recording. It does not show who held the original, how it was copied, or whether every later version came from the same tape. Still, the accounts shared several features. The announcement was brief. It followed a steady pace. The voice, as listeners remembered it, did not rise or fall in the manner of ordinary conversation. There was no clear introduction. No music was reported. No program identification was consistently noted. It sounded detached from the conditions around it. A stored announcement, one listener suggested. That description was a theory, not a technical finding, but it helped explain why the sound seemed to repeat without developing into a broadcast. It began, delivered its short statement, and ended. Then the frequency became quiet again. The wording has never been stable enough to treat as settled fact. Written transcriptions preserve fragments and approximate sounds, but not a verified script. Some listeners believed they heard a direct instruction. Others heard a place reference, or a personal name, or only a sequence of ordinary syllables shaped by static. The surviving story record does not establish which interpretation is correct. That uncertainty did not prevent comparison. In online discussions, listeners placed their tuning notes beside one another. They compared the spacing of the words. They marked pauses with lines and numbers. They asked whether the same phrase had been heard, or whether one person's description had influenced the next person's memory. This is where witness testimony becomes both useful and fragile. A radio operator who writes down a signal during reception is preserving an observation. A person recalling the same sound years later is preserving an interpretation of that observation. Both may matter. They do not carry the same weight. The accounts also differed in the way the signal arrived. One description included a carrier before the voice. In radio terms, that meant the frequency appeared to open in a recognizable way before the announcement began. Another listener recalled a short burst of static first. A third account suggested there was no distinct lead-in at all. The sound simply appeared inside the receiver's noise floor. Those differences could have ordinary explanations. The equipment may have varied. Receivers may have been tuned slightly apart. Atmospheric conditions may have changed the strength and clarity of the signal. A recording made through a small speaker could remove details that were audible in real time. A later copy could add hiss, flatten pauses, or make a clipped beginning seem complete. They could also point toward different sources. A fixed transmitter, a rebroadcast, a mobile signal, and a recording played near a receiver would not necessarily open the channel in the same manner, but the accounts do not provide enough technical detail to choose among those possibilities. They show a pattern of reported reception. They do not locate the equipment that produced it. The strongest evidence, if it survives in usable form, would be the original audio paired with the first tuning log. That combination could show whether the written description was made during reception, whether the recording matches the described timing, and whether later copies preserve the same pauses and signal behavior. The available record does not provide that complete comparison. Instead, the story passed through several layers. A listener heard a transmission. A note was made. Someone else heard a similar transmission. A phrase was copied. Recordings were discussed, compared, and eventually analyzed. With each layer, the signal became easier to describe and harder to verify. Yet one detail remained unusually persistent. The sound was reported on the frequency connected to the closed station, not merely near it, not simply in the same part of the band. The association appeared again in private logs and later recollections. That repetition gave the story its structure. A closed entry in an official record stood against a living sound in private records. The contradiction did not prove that the former station was transmitting. It did not prove that the FCC file was false. It did not prove that every listener heard the same event. It established something narrower and more troubling. People who believed the frequency was inactive continued to return to it because they thought they heard the same short announcement there. The missing words mattered less than the repeated act of checking. They tuned back. They listened again. They wrote down what they could. And when the signal failed to appear, its absence became part of the evidence too. If several listeners heard the same words, why did they disagree about the signal's arrival? And could those differences reveal how it was transmitted? The opening of a transmission can be as useful as its words. A carrier that rises cleanly may suggest one kind of source. A burst of static may suggest another. A signal that appears without a clear lead-in may be nothing more than a weak reception, shaped by distance and interference. It may also be a clue. The listener accounts do not agree on this point. Some describe a brief opening sound before the announcement. Others remember a carrier settling into place, followed by the flat voice. At least one account describes the words as arriving almost by themselves, with no identifiable signal before them. That disagreement does not identify a transmitter. It does something narrower. It shows that the reported event was not received under one stable set of conditions. In West Texas, that distinction matters. The radio path can stretch across a sparse corridor with little built structure to interrupt it. Electrical noise can rise and fall with equipment, weather, and distance. A listen. Air may hear the same transmission differently from one attempt to the next, but the physical site adds a harder problem. At some later point, a visitor went looking for the former station. The account describes a place where the building had already been demolished. There was no intact broadcast room to enter, no confirmed operating console, no visible station structure that could be inspected and matched to the private recordings. What remained was the site itself, and the knowledge that a building had once stood there. The visitor's account is testimony, not a survey. It establishes what that person reported seeing. It does not establish when every piece of equipment was removed, whether anything had been stored elsewhere, or whether the signal had ever come from that property at all. Still, the absence is important. The listeners were not describing a signal from an active public station. The regulatory trail associated the frequency with a station that had closed. The visible facility later disappeared, yet the announcement was said to return intermittently after both facts were already part of the story. That sequence leaves several ordinary possibilities open. Equipment connected to the former station may have been removed before demolition. A transmission could have been repeated from another location. A portable source could have used the same frequency. The signal could have been confused with a nearby or similar frequency during difficult reception. Or the recordings and logs could have preserved different events that later became joined by the station's name. None of these possibilities has been established by the surviving account. The idea of an unauthorized relay appears in later discussion. It is a theory built from the contradiction. If the signal continued after the building was gone, some listeners reasoned, then another transmitter must have carried it. But the records do not identify that transmitter. They do not establish a relay site, an operator, or a continuous operating period. The same caution applies to equipment removed before demolition. It is possible in the ordinary sense. It is not documented here. The question is therefore not simply where the sound came from. It is whether the sound ever behaved like a fixed broadcast at all. The signal openings offer a small test. A stable carrier, heard in the same way by multiple listeners, might support the idea of a consistent transmitter. A changing opening could point toward varying reception conditions, different equipment, or separate sources. A recording with no opening at all might have begun after the transmission was already underway. It might also have been edited, copied, or damaged before anyone else heard it. That last possibility cannot be treated as an accusation. The recording's complete chain of custody is not established. Its existence may be important. Its limits are equally important. The tuning logs carry a different kind of weight. They are not audio. They cannot preserve tone, spacing, or the quality of a carrier. But a log made during reception can show that someone was trying to record a frequency, a time, and a result, rather than relying only on later memory. Even then, a handwritten entry has boundaries. It may omit the equipment used. It may round a time. It may copy a phrase according to what the listener thought was heard. It can support a report without proving every detail inside it. When the accounts were later compared online, the shared elements became more visible. Listeners described a short announcement. They described a steady delivery. They described repetition. They often connected the frequency with the closed station. The differences remained. One person emphasized a burst of static. Another recalled a clean carrier. Someone else remembered no opening sound at all. These accounts may reflect the same signal under different conditions. They may reflect different transmissions. They may also show how a repeated story gradually gathers a common shape. Online comparison can clarify. It can also compress uncertainty. Once one transcription appears, later listeners may use its wording as a guide. A faint syllable becomes a familiar word. A pause becomes intentional. A damaged recording begins to sound more definite each time it is described. That is why the exact announcement remains unsettled. The recurring structure is reported more consistently than the precise wording. The former station's demolished building now stands at the center of that uncertainty. If the building was gone, the site could not by itself explain later reception in the ordinary way, but the site's disappearance does not prove that a hidden device remained. It does not prove that the station's equipment was preserved. It does not prove that the signal originated there at all. It only removes the simplest explanation. A functioning station room was no longer available to account for the voice. The remaining explanations require an additional step: a relay, a mobile transmitter, removed equipment, a mistaken association, or an error preserved across several accounts. The opening sounds may help separate those possibilities, if the original recordings can be compared. A repeated carrier pattern could matter. So could a consistent pause before the first word. But copies, transcriptions, and recollections cannot provide the same certainty as an original file with a verifiable history. For now, the evidence narrows the problem without solving it. The signal was reported after the station's closure. The building was later reported gone. The announcement continued to appear in accounts that did not all describe its arrival in the same way. That difference is more than a technical footnote. If the openings changed because reception changed, the source may have been stable but distant. If they changed because the transmission method changed, the announcement may have moved between sources. And if the records joined separate events under one station identity, then the mystery may have begun with a misidentification that repetition later concealed. The question is no longer whether the old building could have spoken. It is this: after the building disappeared, what physical arrangement allowed the same announcement to keep appearing on the same frequency? The empty site changed the question. It was no longer only, where was the transmitter? It became, why preserve the sound at all? That question belongs to the human part of the record. It cannot be answered by gravel, distance, or receiver drift. It requires motive, and the available material offers only possibilities. One theory holds that the transmission was connected to a concealed dispute around the station. The dispute might have been commercial. It might have involved unauthorized use of equipment. It might have concerned communications that were never meant to enter a public record. Some later discussions used darker language. They mentioned smuggling-related messages, betrayal, and a cover-up. Those terms describe theories, not established events. No surviving record identifies a crime. No verified document names a participant. No account proves that the station carried secret traffic. The theory exists because several ordinary facts sit too close together. An unclear closure, a frequency later associated with a repeated announcement, and a signal that was said to return after the station itself had disappeared. A routine shutdown could explain any one of those facts. It does not easily explain all three. The regulatory trail is important here because it marks the point where responsibility should have become simple. A license existed. The station operated. Then the operation ended. The available FCC-related material was reportedly consulted, but the reason for closure remained unclear within the story record. The files did not provide a clean final account of who controlled the equipment, when it was removed, or what became of the frequency after the license ended. That absence is not proof of concealment. Administrative records can be incomplete, files can be summarized badly, equipment can change hands without leaving a dramatic paper trail. A missing explanation is still only a missing explanation, but it creates room for a second reconstruction. In that reconstruction, the closure was not the end of the station's useful life. It was a transfer point. The public operations stopped. The visible facility was later removed. Something associated with the frequency, however, may have continued in another form. The form is unknown. It could have been a stored recording played through an unauthorized relay. It could have involved equipment taken away before demolition. It could have been a portable transmitter used only at intervals. Or the frequency association itself could have been wrong, with separate signals later joined by memory and repetition. Each possibility explains one detail and strains against another. A fixed relay would help explain a stable announcement. It would also require a location and a power source that the surviving accounts do not provide. Removed station equipment might preserve the sound and the frequency, but it would not explain who operated it later. A portable source could account for intermittent reception, yet it would make the repeated timing and reported stability harder to assess. Signal confusion could resolve the physical contradiction, but it would have to account for the shared phrase described by more than one listener. This is where the private evidence becomes more important than the legend. The strongest material is not a dramatic testimony. It is the collection of ordinary things people kept. Tuning logs, copied phrases, notes about signal strength, audio files described as recordings of the announcement, comparisons posted by listeners who did not necessarily know one another. A log can show that a listener was trying to verify a frequency at a particular time. It cannot prove the identity of the transmitter. A recording can preserve tone, spacing, and background noise. It cannot prove who pressed the switch. A transcription can preserve a phrase while losing the uncertainty in the original syllables. Still, those limitations do not make the material useless. Across the accounts, the announcement was treated as something more deliberate than ordinary interference. The delivery was described as flat. The pacing was stable. The wording, as remembered and copied, appeared short enough to repeat without variation. Several listeners said the signal sounded less like a live broadcast than a stored message. That description matters. A live voice changes with breath. A routine station identification may include music, a call sign, or a sequence of other program sounds. A stored announcement can remain nearly identical from one transmission to the next. If the recordings and logs are reliable, repetition itself becomes a clue to construction. It does not yet become a clue to motive. The message might have been intended for a specific person. It might have been an experiment. It might have been a private joke that escaped its setting. It might have been copied by listeners until its original purpose was lost. The record does not tell us which. One detail did attract repeated attention. Listeners comparing the audio said the phrase seemed to carry a structure that was easier to notice when the recording was manipulated. Some referred to altered speed. Others referred to playing the material backward. At this stage, those observations remained informal. The copies were not known to share a verified chain of custody. Their quality varied. Their origins were not consistently documented. That distinction matters more than the suggestion itself. When people expect a hidden message, a pause can become a word. A hiss can become a consonant. A reversed syllable can resemble a familiar phrase. Online comparison can correct a mistake, but it can also spread one mistake through every later transcription. The question then is not simply whether a phrase can be heard in reverse. The question is whether the same structure appears across independent copies, with timing and sound features that survive the process. That test had not yet been completed. What could be said with more confidence was that the recurring announcement had been treated by at least some listeners as an object worth preserving. The first tuning entry was not an isolated memory. Other listeners attempted to locate the frequency. Some wrote down what they heard. Some claimed to record it. The story grew through comparison, rather than through one person's account alone. That pattern weakens the simplest version of the mistake theory. It does not eliminate it. People can share a mistaken identification. They can repeat a phrase after hearing someone else's transcription. They can assign the same station history to unrelated audio. But a shared mistake still needs a beginning. The human theory places that beginning near the station's closure. Perhaps someone wanted to keep a message alive after the public operation ended. Perhaps someone wanted to make the old frequency appear occupied. Perhaps the announcement was a marker, meant to be recognized by one person and ignored by everyone else. These ideas explain why a transmission might be preserved or disguised. They do not explain why no responsible name appears in the surviving record. They do not explain why the station's closure remains indistinct. And they do not establish that the people discussing the signal understood its original purpose. The cover-up theory has the same limitation. A concealed dispute would give the missing paperwork a possible meaning. It would turn the closure from an administrative blank into a deliberate boundary. But motive cannot be inferred from silence alone. The absence of a clear explanation may reflect poor records, not an organized effort to hide responsibility. The most cautious conclusion is narrower. Someone may have constructed, stored, retransmitted, or altered the announcement. If the audio copies are authentic, the stable form of the message is more consistent with intentional intervention than with random atmospheric noise. That conclusion concerns the sound itself. It does not identify an operator, a location, or a reason. And it leaves one fact untouched. Listeners continued to report the signal after the station building was gone. The site could not answer for the message. The records could not answer for the closure. The recordings, if genuine, could show design without showing the designer. So the next step was not to choose a culprit. It was to examine the sound more carefully than the legend had allowed. Not what the phrase seemed to mean, not who might have benefited. The measurable features first, its pauses, its syllables, its repeated timing, and what, if anything, remained when the recording was turned around. The question now is not whether the recording feels deliberate. It does. The question is what exactly the recording can prove. A careful reconstruction begins with the material that remains. There is the reported tuning log. There are copies of audio said to have been captured by amateur listeners. There are written transcriptions. There are comments from online communities that compared one version with another. These are not equal forms of evidence. A tuning log can establish that someone listened and that someone considered the event unusual enough to record. It cannot by itself establish what came through the receiver. A transcription can preserve the listener's understanding of a phrase. It can also preserve a mistake. A copied recording may contain the original signal, a later transfer, or an edited excerpt. Without a verified chain of custody, each item has a limit. That limit does not make the material worthless. It makes comparison necessary. The first comparison concerns the announcement's pacing. Listeners described a short message with a flat delivery. The pauses were said to occur in similar places. The sound did not resemble a conversation that changed from one reception to the next. It appeared fixed. The same sequence returned, or seemed to return, with little variation. That feature matters because a live speaker usually leaves small differences behind. Breath changes, timing shifts, words are stressed differently. Even a mechanical system can vary when its power supply connection, or recording source changes, a stored announcement would be different. So would a deliberately repeated transmission made from a prepared script. But the available accounts do not establish which of those possibilities applied. They only suggest that the signal had a reap-a-table structure. The second comparison concerns the beginning of each reception. Some listeners described a carrier opening before the announcement. Others recalled a burst of static. Another account treated the message as if it began without an identifiable lead-in. That disagreement may be technical. It may reflect different receivers, different recording levels, or different distances from the source. A weak signal can disappear beneath noise before its strongest portion arrives. A recording device can also cut off the first second without making the loss obvious later. The disagreement may also reflect memory. People who heard a short sound only once often reconstruct its beginning from the portion they understood. Later discussion can make those reconstructions appear more consistent than they were at first. For that reason, the opening sound cannot yet identify the transmitter. It can only tell us that the reception was not preserved in a uniform way. Then the recordings were examined in reverse. The idea is simple. A sample of audio is played backward, so the final sound becomes the first. Ordinary speech becomes an unfamiliar sequence of tones and fragments. Sometimes those fragments resemble words. Sometimes a listener expects a phrase and begins to hear it in the noise. This is where method matters. A reverse playback claim is stronger when the same syllables appear in more than one independent copy. It is stronger when the timing remains stable after the recording is transferred. It is stronger when several listeners identify the same sound before sharing a written interpretation. It is weaker when one damaged copy produces a phrase only after repeated listening. It is weaker when the supposed words are supplied first and then heard by others. It is weaker when the transcription changes from one account to another. The surviving story does not provide a complete test of those conditions. The provenance of the recordings remains uncertain. The original equipment is not available for examination. The full unaltered files are not established in the record. That leaves the reverse message in an unsettled position. It may be evidence of design, it may be an artifact of the recording, or it may show how quickly the mind gives shape to a recurring sound. Still, one detail drew repeated attention. The reversed audio was not described as random noise alone. Listeners reported an apparent sequence. They heard pauses. They heard changes in tone that seemed to divide the sound into units. Some believe those units formed a phrase. That observation does not prove an instruction was hidden in the announcement. It does show that the recording contained enough regularity to invite a structured interpretation. The distinction is narrow, but important. If the phrase survives across copies with the same timing, then someone may have built the sound with intention. That person could have recorded speech, reversed it before transmission, or used some other process that produced the same effect. The finding would support human construction. It would not identify the operator. It would not show that the former station transmitted the later signal. It would not explain why the frequency appeared after the station had closed. It would not turn an unclear regulatory file into proof of a cover-up. Those questions remain separate. The motive theory also has to be tested against the same limits. A concealed commercial dispute could explain why a message was disguised. A personal betrayal could explain why someone wanted a particular listener to recognize it. Unauthorized transmissions could explain the use of an old station frequency. A cover-up could explain why responsibility for equipment and later use was difficult to trace. But a theory is not a record. There is no confirmed name attached to the message. No surviving document identifies an intended recipient. No regulatory entry, as described in the available account, connects the recurring announcement to a hidden operator. The closure remains unclear, but unclear does not mean intentional. A gap in paperwork may come from incomplete filing, lost material, or a simple failure to preserve the reason. The theory gains weight only if separate details point in the same direction. A fixed message would suggest preparation. A repeated signal would suggest persistence. A frequency tied to a closed station would suggest either reuse or misidentification. The disappearance of the building would remove the most obvious physical source. The reverse playback pattern, if repeatable, would suggest an additional layer of construction. Together, those details describe an intervention by someone at some point, more readily than they describe a natural broadcast that formed itself without human control. But they still leave the central gap untouched. The listeners did not establish where the signal came from after the station site was gone. A rebroadcast could account for the later reception. So could a portable transmitter, equipment removed before demolition, or an unrelated source using the same frequency. Signal confusion remains possible. So does an error in the original association between the frequency and the former station. The records cannot rank these possibilities with confidence. There is also the problem of repetition. A message intended for one person would not necessarily need a public audience. It could be sent at intervals, waiting for someone who knew when to listen. That would make the strange persistence seem purposeful. It would also explain why the announcement remained short and unchanged. Well, that interpretation may be imposed after the fact. Listeners heard a repeated sound and supplied a recipient because repetition usually suggests intent. The safest conclusion is smaller. The available recordings and logs may preserve evidence of a deliberately constructed audio pattern. The reverse playback claim deserves comparison with the original material, not belief or dismissal in advance. The human theory can explain why someone might create, repeat, or disguise a message. It cannot establish who acted, why the station closed, or how the signal was later received. In the desert, the distinction would have been difficult to hear. Cold salt wind moved across the empty corridor. Paper rustled beside a receiver. Electrical hiss filled the spaces between words. A listener could mark the time, write down the phrase, and still have no way to mark the source. The record ends there, at the edge of what careful comparison can recover. If the reversed syllables are stable, they may show that the signal was designed rather than accidental. If they change from copy to copy, the hidden message may belong more to interpretation than to transmission. And before that question can be settled, another must be answered. Which recording is closest to the original, and who first carried it away from the receiver? The investigation now reaches its narrowest point. Not the point where every possibility disappears. The point where the record can no longer carry the weight placed on it. At the beginning, there was a frequency associated with a station that was reported to have closed. An amateur listener entered the reception in a tuning log. Other listeners later described a recurring announcement. Some kept notes. Some claimed to preserve recordings. The accounts did not match in every detail, but they shared enough features to keep the story alive. Then came the administrative trail. The frequency was connected, through reported license and regulatory references, to the former station. The available FCC material did not provide a clear explanation for the closure within the source account. That absence matters. It creates a gap. It does not, by ITSI LF, show that records were hidden or that anyone acted improperly. The distinction is simple, but important. A record can confirm an association. It cannot confirm every event later attributed to that association. The station was reported closed. The building was later reported demolished. Yet listeners said the announcement continued to appear intermittently. That is the central contradiction. It is also the place where the story becomes most vulnerable to error. Online communities tried to repair the contradiction by assembling the fragments. Tuning notes were compared. Phrases were transcribed. Audio copies were exchanged. The same pauses were marked in different places. Similar syllables were heard by people who had already been told what to listen for. This is where evidence and expectation begin to touch. A listener may hear a repeated rhythm without hearing words. Another listener may supply words to that rhythm. Once supplied, the words can seem obvious. The mind is efficient at completing patterns. It is less reliable at showing where the pattern began. The reverse playback claim rests inside that uncertainty. According to the reported analysis, the announcement sounded different when played backward. A phrase seemed to emerge. The wording has not been securely fixed in the surviving account. Its source is not established. Its intended recipient is not known. The proper test is not whether one person can hear a phrase in reverse. The test is whether the same phrase appears across copies that can be compared with the original recording. That comparison would require more than a transcription. It would require the recording itself, or a demonstrably faithful transfer. It would require attention to tape speed, background hiss, signal distortion, and the possibility that later copies were edited or processed. It would require knowing whether the copies came from separate receptions or from one file repeated through the community. No verified chain of custody has been established for the recordings, transfers, or transcriptions described here. That does not make every account false. It limits what the accounts can prove. The same caution applies to the logs. Matching entries can support the claim that listeners were trying to verify one another. They can show that a phrase or a timing pattern circulated between observers. But if later notes were copied from earlier notes, apparent agreement may reflect transmission of an idea rather than independent reception. There is a practical question beneath all of this. What would intentional construction look like? It might appear as a stable sequence of tones, a fixed duration, a repeated pause, a phrase preserved with the same unusual spacing. It might include a reversal that remains recognizable after ordinary differences in recording quality are accounted for. Those features could suggest that someone prepared the audio rather than producing it by accident. But preparation is not the same as identification. A deliberately recorded announcement could have been broadcast from equipment connected to the old station. It could have been rebroadcast from a different location. It could have come from a portable transmitter. Equipment might have been removed before demolition. The frequency might have been confused with a nearby or related channel. Atmospheric conditions might have carried an unrelated signal into the listening area. The surviving record does not select one of these explanations. It also does not establish that every reported reception came from the same source. This weakens the most dramatic version of the story. If a single transmitter operated continuously from the former station, the demolished building should have left some physical or administrative trace. None is established here. If a hidden relay operated elsewhere, its location remains unknown. If the signal was intermittent, the gaps make reconstruction harder, not easier. The human motive theory faces the same boundary. A concealed commercial dispute, unauthorized transmission, personal betrayal, or cover-up could explain why someone might prepare a message, preserve it, or disguise its origin. The unexplained closure provides a possible setting for that theory. It does not provide a name, a motive, or a recipient. Motive is a frame around evidence. It is not evidence of the person who stands inside it. The reported response from the FCC must also remain in proportion. Accounts characterize the agency as declining or not pursuing a formal investigation. That is a reported response within the story record, not an independently confirmed finding of institutional involvement. A limited response may reflect the age of the material, the quality of the complaint, jurisdictional limits, or simple lack of actionable information. It leaves a gap. It does not fill the gap with guilt. The strongest conclusion is therefore narrower than the legend. If the preserved recording and the matching logs are authentic, and if the reverse playback structure can be reproduced from the original audio, then the recurring message reflects intentional human construction or intervention. It was not merely an accidental sound produced by the desert, atmospheric noise, or an innocent receiver defect. That conclusion would establish design in the message. It would not establish who designed it. It would not prove why. It would not show that the original station transmitted every later occurrence. It would not locate the equipment that produced the signal after the building was gone. And if the reverse phrase changes from copy to copy, or depends on a listener's chosen speed and emphasis, then the conclusion becomes weaker. The hidden message may be an interpretation imposed on unstable material. Repetition can feel intentional even when the source is ordinary. The most persuasive evidence would have to survive that test. A clean comparison. An original reception. A dated tuning entry made before the phrase was circulated. A recording whose handling can be followed from the listener to the later analysis. Without those links, the story remains assembled from pieces that may belong together, but cannot be shown to belong together. Still, one detail resists easy correction. Listeners reported hearing the signal after the visible station's site had disappeared. That statement may contain a technical answer. The broadcast could have come from a relay. A mobile source could have used the old frequency. Equipment could have been removed and operated elsewhere. A mistaken association could have attached a new transmission to an old station. Or the surviving accounts may have combined separate events into one continuing story. Each explanation is ordinary enough to be possible. None is confirmed. This is why the case does not end with a solved transmitter, a verified operator, or a final official file. It ends with a division between what the evidence may show and what the legend asks it to show. The message, if the audio record is sound, appears to have been made by someone. The later source remains outside the record. A voice may have been constructed deliberately. A signal may have been repeated by human equipment. The station may have supplied the original setting without supplying the later transmission. These statements can stand together without producing a complete explanation. Near the former site, there is no confirmed transmitter to inspect. There is no established chain leading from the old license to the later reception. There is only the closed frequency, the missing line in the larger story, the faded ink of administrative records, and the private notes of listeners trying to make the signal measurable. The final contradiction is therefore also the clearest one. Human intervention may explain the message. It may even explain why the message was preserved. But if the recording and logs are accepted, what carried that same signal into later receivers after the station was gone? At the former station site, there is no building left to inspect. No confirmed transmitter remains in view. The ground offers only the ordinary evidence of removal and time. Gravel, wind, weathered fragments that cannot by themselves identify what once stood there. That absence is important. It does not prove that every later reception was false. It does not prove that equipment was hidden. It simply limits what the site can tell us now. The surviving story begins with amateur listeners tuning across a West Texas frequency. They reported a recurring announcement. Some kept written tuning logs. Some described recordings. Others remembered only the sound and the effort to find it again. Their accounts were not identical. The signal did not always arrive with the same carrier, the same static, or the same apparent strength. Those differences matter because a radio signal is not a memory. It is a physical event shaped by equipment, distance, atmospheric conditions, interference, and the listener's own settings. A written note made during reception is one kind of record. A copied tape is another. A later transcription is further removed. None should be treated as interchangeable. Still, the accounts share a central detail. The frequency was associated with a station believed to have closed. The public record, as described in the surviving material, does not clearly explain that closure. The visible building was later demolished. Yet listeners said the announcement continued to appear intermittently. That sequence leaves a narrow but persistent contradiction. The station's administrative life ended. Its physical location disappeared. The sound, according to the reports, did not end with either event. The regulatory trail cannot settle the matter. FCC-related records were reportedly consulted. They establish the station's connection to the frequency and reflect its closure. They do not provide a complete explanation for why the station closed. They also do not identify a later transmitter. Accounts describe the agency as declining or not pursuing a formal investigation. But that reported response is only a gap in the story. It is not proof of institutional involvement. The same caution applies to the theory of a cover-up. An unclear closure can invite suspicion. It can suggest that equipment changed hands, that responsibility was transferred without a full public explanation, or that someone wanted the station's final purpose to remain indistinct. But a missing explanation is not evidence of a particular crime. A possible motive is not a proven act. What the recordings may establish is narrower. If a preserved recording is authentic, and if matching logs describe the same timing and phrase, then the announcement appears to have been constructed. Its repetition sounds more consistent with a prepared message, or with deliberate retransmission, than with an accidental pattern in ordinary radio noise. The reported reverse playback adds another layer. A phrase seems to emerge when the audio is played backward. That discovery may indicate design, but only if the original recording can be examined and the result repeated from comparable copies. If the sound survives only through unstable transfers, heavy processing, or memory-based transcription, the interpretation becomes less secure. The ear is skilled at finding language in noise. That skill can reveal structure. It can also impose structure where none was intended. So the strongest conclusion remains limited. If the recordings and matching logs are accepted as genuine, the recurring message reflects intentional human construction or intervention. Someone at some point created or preserved a signal with a repeated form. That conclusion does not identify the operator. It does not establish the recipient. It does not explain the motive. It does not prove that the original station transmitted every later occurrence. Several ordinary possibilities remain open. The signal may have come from an unknown relay. Equipment may have been removed before demolition and used elsewhere. A portable transmitter may have produced some receptions. Listeners may have associated the wrong frequency with the former station. Copies may have been altered by handling or confused with one another. The evidence may contain an error that no later retelling can repair. None of these explanations is satisfying. Each requires a detail that the record does not preserve. There is no verified chain of custody for every reported recording. There is no confirmed location for a later transmitter. There is no complete closure narrative to connect the administrative file with the private logs. The paper trail ends where the listener's questions become most precise. And that is why the story remains quiet rather than conclusive. The mystery does not require an impossible source. Human intervention is enough to explain the message's construction. But human intervention does not explain how the signal was later heard after the station site had disappeared. The desert corridor eventually returned to its normal sounds. Cold wind moved across the open ground. Loose paper shifted against a fence or a forgotten piece of metal. Somewhere, a receiver could still produce electrical hiss when the dial was left between stations. None of those sounds carried a confirmed announcement. The silence that followed is not a resolution. It is only the last condition described by the available record. A closed frequency remains in the logs. A demolished building remains in the testimony. The reverse message remains an interpretation that may be tested, but not simply believed. Between them is the unanswered question that no surviving file appears to close. If the voice was deliberately made by a person, and if it was heard after the station was gone, where was the transmitter when the last verified listener heard it? At the former station site, there is no building left to enter. No confirmed transmitter remains. The ground offers no clear answer. Wind moves across the West Texas corridor. It carries cold salt from distant air, dust from the road, and the small rustle of paper in an empty folder. What remains is narrower than the legend. Listeners reported a recurring signal on a frequency associated with a station that had closed. Some kept tuning logs. Some described recordings. Some supplied only recollections or transcriptions. Those materials are not equal. A written note can preserve a time and a frequency. It cannot prove what the receiver sounded like. A recording can preserve sound. It does not by itself establish where the transmitter stood. The regulatory record connects the frequency to the former station. It does not provide a clear explanation for the closure within the surviving account. That absence is a gap. It is not proof of a concealed crime, and it is not proof that every later reception came from the station. The building was reportedly demolished before a later visitor examined the site. Yet intermittent receptions were still described afterward. That contradiction remains the hardest detail to set aside. An unknown relay could account for it. So could preserved equipment, a mobile source, a mistaken association, or an error in the evidence. None of those possibilities has been demonstrated. The reverse playback phrase belongs in the same careful category. If comparable original recordings produce the same syllables, timing, and structure, deliberate human construction becomes the strongest limited explanation. It would suggest that someone made, altered, or retransmitted the message. It would not identify that person. It would not establish the motive. It would not locate the final source. The cover-up theory may explain why an old station's purpose was kept indistinct. It may explain why a message was preserved or disguised. But a theory is not a record. A witness account is not a transmitter map. And an incomplete investigation cannot be turned into institutional guilt, simply because the paperwork feels unsatisfying. My own conclusion is quiet. The signal was probably shaped by human choices, if the preserved audio and matching logs are authentic. The rest remains uncertain. That uncertainty is not a failure of imagination. It is the boundary set by the evidence. Years later, the place is ordinary again. The locks are gone. The faded ink is still easier to study than the air where the signal was heard. Somewhere beyond the demolished site, a receiver may have opened on the same frequency, carried the repeated sound, and closed again. We do not know where that transmission came from. We only know that for a time people heard it after the place connected to it had disappeared. The record ends there, with the source still unconfirmed, and the choice to send it still belonging to someone unknown.
My takeaway is that honest communication, accountability, and clear boundaries matter more than winning a family conflict. What do you think?